So I asked you guys whether or not Warhammer 40K needs an emergency out-of-sequence balance pass, and the majority said yes. Let's talk about game balance in Warhammer 40K, Games Workshop's curious balance passes that happen between balance passes, and whether or not we're likely to get one this time round. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Warhammer 40K and game balance updates. Earlier in the week I did a fairly big video talking through faction win rates and where they seem to sit right now, and as has been the case for most of 10th edition, the vast majority of factions in 40k really aren't in too bad a place. Games Workshop previously had their stated target of between 45 to 55% in terms of win rates, not something that they've really mentioned for a while now, though just with general vibes for them, the vast majority of factions can do pretty well when played in their stronger forms. Some might be a bit better in the casual setting, some in the competitive, and plenty of them do have all sorts of criticisms for their game balance. It could be video topics in their own right, but in general in terms of army performance compared with most of its past, 40k really isn't in too bad a spot. Most factions and most units in the game can do well from casual games to all the way to the highest level, and that's definitely not always been the case. Obviously some factions are struggling right now, maybe Orcs being a good example, but the majority of factions do seem to sit somewhere in the mid tier. At least compared with 10th edition's recent trends though, it does feel like there's rather more armies breaking the power curve compared with normal. Something's always got to be strongest, but it feels like there's several armies that are just significantly stronger than quite a lot of the rest of them. There are plenty of factions that are powerful, but in particular Death Guard, Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights are rather sticking their heads over the top a bit, and just doing well on all metrics between competitive games, top tournament results, and performance in more casual play. Just based on general vibes, it did feel like this has been worse than 10th edition has had it for a little while, at least in terms of top factions breaking the power curve. So I took a look back at the similar versions of that same video, just to compare what armies were at the top, what sort of win rates they had and how well they were doing, and based on that metric at least, it seems that things are a bit worse than normal. Currently we've got the top armies on 59%, 57% and 55% going by tournament win rates. In April it looked like everything was under 55, at least post the Mordaka nerf. And then over the past year, we've had things like Demons, Genestealer Cult, Thousand Suns, and Necrons all pretty high. But in general, for armies at the 55% win rate, there's usually just been one that's passed it at maximum, and usually only just so. Though now it looks like we've got two armies that are at least fairly solidly over that, and one on the borderline. Based on this, at least, it does look like 40k has taken a small step back in terms of the majority of factions really struggling to beat the top dogs. It obviously has been worse at times in the past though, say 10th edition launch with Eldari and Genestealer Cult getting it well over 60%, or Orcs with their brief run with Mordaka before that was emergency patched. The faction was overall a bit over 60 there. Tournament win rates aren't the only way that you can assess a faction's strength, but it does look like particularly these three are doing well by all the rest of the metrics as well. One other good one that I've been looking at is the first 5 games of an army going undefeated in a grand tournament as a good way to show which factions are doing well there. By my count, Death Guard had over 30 of those, Imperial Knights had 20 and Chaos Knights 16. Not too bad for them given that they hadn't even been active for the entirety of this balance update. And the 3 armies seem to be the first, second and fourth most played armies in 40k in competitive games respectively, making up over a fifth of the competitive meta just with 3 armies out of 28. Death Guard had their codex come out just before the previous balance update, seemingly just a bit too late for any sort of adjustments to be made to them. They have maybe a lot of their strength through certain powerful datasheets like the Blight Launcher bloat drones, Death Shroud deep striking, and Plague Marine combos, though there are other stuff. The Chaos Knights got good stuff with their codex, as enormously discounted Titanic Knight bodies were a big factor in them, but they've also got some nice detachment rules, in particular Lords of Dread with those objective control 5 sticky objectives, though they do well with Infernal Lance as well. And then the Imperial Knights got some stat line changes to match the Chaos ones, and some rather spectacular points cuts as well. That was kind of a surprise, as it seems like the Imperial Knight Codex has been delayed for whatever reason, so they couldn't release it at the same time as the Chaos one. I'm not certain if the new lower points costs are supposed to reflect nerfed datasheets in the Codex somehow, but certainly in the interim they've got a bunch of datasheets that are clearly too good for their points cost, particularly Canis Rex. I feel like at this point, 6 weeks post-update, we do have enough data collected to be fairly sure about this, rather than it just being random noise. Though of course that's not to say there aren't other strong things out there, at least in terms of the tournament statistics at the moment. The Thousand Suns and the Genestealer Cult both seem to be doing rather well, both with high win rates and very high rates of people winning tournaments with them relative to the amount of people playing them. Before we move on to talk about the possibility of emergency balance updates though, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold, makers of magnetic carry cases. The idea with these, as with most magnetic cases, is to attach magnets to the bases of your miniatures, then have them housed on some magnetic sheets within a sturdy case. so you can store loads of miniatures very close together without the need for insulation or anything like that, so they can store quite compact. Tabletop Stronghold's take on these style cases are their mag cases. These ones are made of notably sturdy MDF, really hard to break or damage when they're put together, and in the boxes there's some slide in, slide out trays made of steel, which you can adjust the height of and put them in at different levels depending on the height of the miniatures that you're transporting. On the front there's a nice acrylic sheet to allow you to see what's where, and it can be nice to have your models visible while they're being stored as well. Broadly speaking, I've generally seen people very positive in reviews about them on Reddit and down in the YouTube comments and places. You can check them out, links down in the video description. Currently they've got a sale on for around 25% off. I'll cycle back to them briefly at the end of the video with a few of their designs if you're interested. Getting back to game balance and updates for this though, as mentioned earlier, it seems that there's a good amount of sentiment for people wanting an update sooner rather than later. I asked you guys whether or not they should do an emergency balance pass to address Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights and Death Guard specifically. If they chose to address those things, whether or not they should make changes now, or whether they should wait until the normal update schedule, which going by Games Workshop's quarterly balance updates will probably be in around about 6 weeks' time or so. 6,000 people voted on that, and it came out with a narrow win for changes now rather than later. 52% of people, it seems, wanting a patch now, 41% preferring to wait later until the schedule, and only 7% of people not wanting any changes or having some other take on the matter, some of which included buffing weak armies, or they should get it right first time, or just some general fatigue with rules updates. Some of those might be slight tangents. I feel like buffing weak armies is definitely all well and good and should be done, but if, like seems to be the case at the moment, you've only got a few armies that are clearly notably stronger than the rest, it probably makes more sense to tone those down a bit, rather than literally buffing another 25 factions in the game to a greater or lesser extent. You're just going to have a whole load of rampant power creep at that point. Though yes, it would obviously be nice to help out the struggling factions in the game at the same time as reining in the top stuff just a little bit. I certainly agree with the last point that the main question is whether or not it's worth doing this sort of thing out of sequence. 40k does have a reputation for really quite fast rules updates anyway, to the point where it genuinely puts some people off. So I guess maybe this represents a bit of a dividing line as to whether or not people want more changes sooner, where it does feel like there's a clear focus problem to be addressed, or whether Games Workshop should only be allowed to mess with 40k rules once every 3 months, as opposed to once every 3 months and several times in between. I feel like perhaps one of the slightly frustrating things about the top end of the 40k meta at the moment is that it mainly seems to be a points problem as opposed to a rules problem. The Imperial and Chaos Knights are mainly just driven by enormous great big chunky stat lines with massive damage that certainly casual armies are going to struggle to overcome. And obviously judging by their tournament performance, lots of competitive armies as well, with the sheer amount of tournament victories they're getting. Imperial Knights have been kind of found too solidly strong for quite a lot of 10th edition. So it certainly seems pretty crazy to just take Canis Rex, who was already auto-include pretty much, and then suddenly drop him by 70 points, the only price being a side grade on durability. I think just about everyone could have told you that that would be a bad idea. For the Chaos Knights, it's absolutely great to see the big knights being good, but feels like there's probably going to be a happy medium somewhere between them actually being strong and the main thing in the army, versus their sheer power pushing them to top 3 armies in the game. Maybe balance-wise, it feels like that sticky objectives with 5OC thing that they get in the Lords of Dread might be something that's adequately strong to attract nerfs, but certainly feels if Games Workshop's aim was to adjust them down from a 57% to closer to a 50%, some small points increases could do that fairly well. Out of the 3, it feels like Death Guard certainly have the stronger mechanics, maybe more depth to the faction, and more stratagem and synergy interactions. Though I do feel like that's probably a strength of the codex and not a weakness, and if they can make Death Guard datasheets pay an appropriate amount of points for those powerful abilities, it'd be quite nice to see them intact. Perhaps the single most obvious points adjustment is the featured bloat drone with the heavy blight launcher to go up a touch. Those things are just pretty monstrously efficient fire support for just 100 points, and then otherwise I'd guess rises to Death Shroud or Plague Marines, or just some sort of very small incremental points increase across the board. Obviously the aim of all of these is to push them more into the mid-tier as opposed to over-nerf them, though of course you never know with Games Workshop. Out of sequence balance updates do seem to have been something they've returned to a bit for Warhammer 40k. There's been at least 2 really quite notable ones earlier this year. The normal pattern for them seems to be with the post-data slate FAQs and bug fixes, which tend to arrive around 4 weeks after a balance update. I feel like last year they tended to be a bit more restrained and generally more fixing errors or interactions that didn't really work, more so than fixing balance problems that they created, but that's definitely been something that's happening in 2025. For 2 of the best recent examples, the Mordaka detachment for the Orcs was absolutely annihilating things. As a detachment, that was up at something like 65% win rates or so, which is kind of crazy. For that one, the data slate came out on March the 13th with that new detachment, and then it was hit by an enormous nerf on April the 9th, just a tiny bit under a month later. It was a shame that was quite so heavy-handed though, instantly taking it from the single strongest thing in Warhammer 40k pretty much, to super weak and skipping over everything in between. Another recent one was the Necron Starshatter Arsenal. That one released in the Grotmas detachment on the 6th of December, and that entire update felt sort of loosely associated with the balanced data slate that happened in mid-December then. Again, it was around about a month or so until that got some stratagem changes. For that one, it felt a lot more incremental and maybe a balanced nerf done right. It still remains a powerful detachment for the Necrons and a good rival for the Awakened dynasty, so perhaps feels like a good example of a nerf done fairly well. I must admit though, these out-of-sequence ones that don't really get announced very well by Warhammer community probably aren't very helpful for more casual players to keep up with, particularly when Games Workshop did have a stated way of doing things with things happening quarterly. There's a chance that some significant things could change in the interim. On the other hand though, if they are going to do balanced data slates and change absolutely loads of things in the game, that seems pretty good odds they're not going to get literally everything right, and something is going to emerge rather strong. So doing these out-of-sequence updates maybe make the rest of the balance thing a bit more worth it, as to some extent it's all very well having the vast majority of factions in Warhammer 40k well balanced, but then if you just got one or two that are absolutely stomping the rest of them, it's not really a great thing for game balance, either for the players of other armies or that faction themselves. If they did want to do one of these emergency style balance passes alongside a follow-up FAQ after a datasheet, it did feel like the update in which they would have done that has already gone by though. There was an update that happened on July the 9th, there was at least some sort of FAQs and changes to just about every faction in Warhammer 40k, most of it really quite minor. Perhaps the biggest and most standout balance things were a big nerf to the Thousand Suns Warp Meld pact for some reason, the Space Wolves Iron Priest and his double shooting Predator style ways, and the World Eater's Bloodletter summoning stratagem. It maybe felt a little bit odd to see those three things addressed, as they were really quite obvious rules changes made for a balanced purpose. I feel like for the Iron Priest buff they hadn't really thought it through, that he basically makes a Predator shoot with the strength of 2 Predators. The World Eater's Bloodletter summoning stratagem was weirdly powerful, and the Thousand Suns Warp Meld pact was doing very well for a small amount of players. But on the other hand, it didn't really feel like any of them were strong to a problematic extent, so maybe it was some way between balance update and trying to shift around rules they'd not really thought through. Obviously the Iron Priest and the Khorne Demonkin thing were quite big and impactful, but the Warp Meld pact did feel a bit unusually punitive and felt like a step back for faction balance, given that it was really quite a strong and powerful Thousand Suns build. But then if you took away the synergies from the best units that could use them, then you have a very weak detachment indeed. I would have guessed if they were going to do some sort of update to the Death Guard, it probably would have been in that one, but maybe they want to keep the rules as they are and save it for a points update, and for some reason they think it might be less confusing to change rules and not points. Just speculation here, but I do wonder if there's a chance they might have delayed it for their Tacoma Open tournament. Games Workshop these days does tend to be a little bit more careful around some of the really big standout events of the tournament calendar, often trying to schedule their balance updates so they're not going to drop just before, and maybe being a bit more likely to change things after if they're going to. Maybe if they wanted to do some more serious balance changes, it might have been a reason to delay it until after that event. That happened on the 18th of July. The FAQ roundup after the balance pass happened on the 9th. So I guess maybe there's a small possibility they didn't want to make too radical changes on top of things just before. I think they often try not to drop entire balanced data slates and huge changes just before a big event like this, as it means that the people playing at the event are kind of weirdly showcasing a sort of dead meta that's already moved on, which isn't necessarily the worst thing for attendees or anything like that, but I feel like maybe does just lessen interest a bit as people are interested to find out about changes and different ways to play their armies. If that was the case, I guess there could be a possibility that we might see something like an update next week. They often drop rules on Wednesdays these days, it seems. Again, that is complete speculation though. But if they didn't decide to do it now, then I feel like there'd be quite a lot more argument just to hold on until the next update, given that the gap between the two is going to be getting gradually smaller. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts though. Let me know to how much of an extent you think that factions like Knights and Death Guard are a problem for Warhammer 40k, and whether or not they need a balance adjustment in the short or the medium term, and whether or not you think Games Workshop is likely to do one this time around. I think I would argue that it would be good for game balance for at least some targeted nerfs to a few units in those factions, obviously not with the point to ruin them or anything like that, but hopefully bring more in line with other factions, and in theory it could be a good thing for faction balance as well, rather than just having a few meta units that dominate, having a few more options shining through. I feel like debates around this though and people's opinions on it are maybe quite a good showcase for the differing opinions of how Games Workshop should handle balance updates and things like that, whether or not they're going too fast and overloading people who don't want so many changes to their army in rapid succession, or whether if they are going to make some obvious changes to a faction that is probably going to help game balance, those ones should be done sooner rather than later. With their balance updates and things though, it does maybe depend on just how hard they go with other changes there. If they're making massive changes to other factions as well and trying to overhaul them, then there's a good chance they might create as many problems as they fix at the same time. As mentioned though, let me know your thoughts on the topic. Would you like to see a targeted out-of-sequence 40k points update or not? I'll leave this one there for now though, and just circle back briefly to the video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold, and their magnetic carry cases that are on sale at the moment. For a brief look over their range, here's their tray capacity, around about 90 odd 25mm bases when maximally loaded per sheet, and here's a few other unit types. And then those trays stack inside various different heights of boxes. Here's the mini one, for $75 or £72 while on sale. That includes postage to these destinations, but there might be things like import duties on top of that. Still quite a lot of room in the smallest ones for some big tanks of course. Here's the more standard sized one, which is pretty tall, as you can see by the Chaos Knight on the bottom floor of it. Should be big enough for quite a lot of armies out there. They come with some magnets included, and I'll leave the dimensions on the screen. Then there's the really big one, basically two of the previous attached together, big enough for some entire collections in there I'm sure. They do also have a few other things like their MDF competitive terrain set. If you're interested in that one, there's a discount for buying them alongside a magnetic case. In any case though, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. You can find them linked in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, then check out the channel affiliate discount links in the video description and the Patreon page linked in the video description below. A massive thank you to anyone supporting there, and a huge thank you for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.